Hello, everyone. I'm Whitney Keys, the Executive Director of Seattle City Club, and I want to welcome you to Civic Cocktail. Did you know that for 40 years, our nonprofit has been working to help inform, connect, and engage people around civic issues? And this strengthens our region. And we do this by bringing different people and diverse perspectives together for civil, respectful conversations. Our priorities for the year include creating more opportunities to engage people around civics and also to enable more dialogue across our differences. And that's exactly what we'll be doing in this program as we explore the state of our democracy. We hope this is the first of a multi-part series discussing what's ahead for various political parties with people who have different viewpoints. And we're starting the conversation talking about next steps for the Republican Party. Before our program begins, I want to recognize the Seattle Channel as our longtime media partner and Town Hall as our nonprofit program partner. And we have 3 media partners: KOW, Crosscut, and the Evergrey. And Civic Cocktail wouldn't be possible without generous support from Comcast, our presenting sponsor. Looking ahead, Seattle City Club is hosting a free virtual book club on Thursday, February 11th, and we're going to be reading Why We're Polarized by Ezra Klein. And we have a fantastic lineup of speakers. Everyone is welcome, whether you've read the book or whether you've finished the book. I actually have a couple chapters to go. And we have more Civic Cocktails coming up. They are usually the first Wednesday of every month. And in March, we're hosting a series of virtual civic boot camps where we're going to be learning about housing and homelessness issues and solutions that involve our community. So check out our website, social media, or sign up for our newsletter if you want more details. When Civic Cocktail begins, we invite you to be a part of the conversation by typing your questions in the chat box at any time. Even if we can't get to yours, all questions are appreciated and read. And we're going to be committed to ensuring that this is a civil, thoughtful exchange of ideas. It takes a lot of resources and hard work for nonprofits like Seattle City Club and Town Hall to produce programs like this. And so during and immediately after it, you'll have the chance to donate online, or you can text to give. Just text the word civics to the number 44321. And whatever you give will be appreciated and split by our 2 organizations. So thanks in advance for your support. And now it's that time to grab the drink of your choice, sit back, relax, and enjoy Civic Cocktail with our host, journalist Joni Balter.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another great season of Civic Cocktail. I'm Joni Balter here tonight with 2 guests who know a lot about the Republican Party and who can help answer a few key questions like, what are the GOP's next best steps? What does the future look like for the local and national Republican Party? Big welcome to Rick Wilson, longtime Republican strategist, co-founder of the Lincoln Project, and author of a new book called Running Against the Devil. Also thrilled to have Bill Bryant, the 2016 GO nominee for governor of Washington State. Thanks to both of you for being with us. To start things off, Rick, you helped create the Lincoln Project and you have recently left the GOP. For folks not so familiar, what is the Lincoln Project and what were your goals for the 2020 election?
Well, the Lincoln Project is a group of folks who came together mostly from the Republican Party, who could not stomach or tolerate the destruction Donald Trump was wreaking on the country, his unconstitutional actions, his corruption, his authoritarian tendencies, his statism, his cruelty. And we came together in the very end of 2019, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that said, we are dedicated to defeating Donald Trump's enablers, and Trumpism as a political philosophy. We believe that all those things are very dangerous to this country. So we did the first part. That was ironically the easy part. Defeating his enablers. We've taken 4 of them off the board so far, in Arizona, Colorado, and Georgia, and we're delighted with the results of that.
And was that the goal for the 2020 election? How would you describe the goal for the
we only spent about 12.5% of our resources on the Senate races, but we managed to work very carefully in those 4. Cory Gardner and Martha McSally were our first 2 targets. We hit them early. It had a devastating impact. They never quite got back on their feet after that. We played in a few other races that we did not cross the finish line on. Lindsey Graham and Sue Collins. We did not cross the finish line on those. But then we went into Georgia with a very carefully directed, very carefully strategically crafted program and helped win those 2 Senate seats. And we managed to wrest control of the Senate away from Mitch McConnell, given some of the work that we've done in those 4 states.
So, Bill, the events of January 6th, some people say, have brought the Republican Party to breaking point. And I wanted to ask you, is that a fair description? Does that even apply to Washington State? What's your summation of that?
Joni, I think it depends on the decisions and that the party makes going forward and how it decides to define itself. If this party chooses to define itself based on loyalty to a former president, then I think it could cease to be a party, because a party needs to be founded on principles and policies, not on a person. But if the party decides that it is going to begin focusing on pragmatic solutions that really improve the lives of people, then yes, it's going to be a viable party going forward. It's going to have to listen and do a better job of listening than we did. If you got time, let me tell you a quick story from 2015 that proved to be pretty damn prophetic. And it was when my campaign was just getting started. I was down in Pierce County and did my little spiel. This is summer of 2015. And as I was leaving, there was this older gentleman sitting on a folding chair right by the door. And as I walked by him, he said, "Son, can I ask you a question?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, when you're making, and when he said you, he meant elected officials. He said, when you're making decisions, do you ever think about people like me? And he told me that he'd worked hard his whole life. He had put his kids through school. He owned a house. He was scared to death on whether or not he was going to be able to survive on his retirement and keep his house. And he said, do you even think about people like us? And I remember choking up because I saw my grandpa. And what I didn't realize at that moment in 2015, that wasn't a one-off. He spoke for millions and millions of people in this country. And people like me can jump on a plane and fly to the other side of the planet and negotiate a trade agreement. But meanwhile, people like him felt that no one paid attention to them. No one was listening, and that we didn't care. And if this party wants to go forward and be viable, it has got to start listening to people like him.
So for both of you, what is your quick take on the future of the GOP? Rick, you go first. I mean, how do they go forward?
Yeah, I think Bill and I probably agree on this. If the party becomes a one issue, one party, one test, and that litmus test is, do you love Donald Trump and are you loyal to him? Then that party is in a box canyon, politically speaking. It does not have room to grow. If it returns to being a party that believes in individual liberty and the control of the power of the state over the individual, and of free and fair markets, and of rule of law, and an individual responsibility and accountability, I think it's got a lot of potential. I think this country desperately needs a center-right party. I mean, it needs to have a center-right party that believes in things, that believes in a counterbalance. So we have that homeostatic sort of balance we had for many generations in this country, where the left never got too much of what they wanted for too long, and the right never got too much of what they wanted for too long. That's what the founders wanted. That's what the American people have voted for time and again, is balance. And right now, I think that both parties, the Republican Party it's not even ideological anymore. It's moved out into this space where it is this personality cult-driven kind of feel. And the Democratic Party is shattering along its own internal divisions. So we're in a weird space right now in terms of the future of both parties.
Well, and I would argue, Rick, that what you're saying might be true on the national level. I do not think it's true in Washington State.
No, I agree with you, Bill.
Washington State, we have always been sort of a different type of Republican.
No doubt, no doubt.
And when you look at the leadership of Washington State's Republican Party, it is not people espousing crazy ass theories about Jewish satellites starting forest fires. It's not condoning violence at all. I mean, 2 of our 3 Republican Congress members voted to impeach the president. Our Secretary of State, a Republican, refuted the president's allegations of voter fraud. We have the House Minority Leader, a Republican, who removed a Republican member of the House because of his getting a little bit too comfortable with groups that were very questionable. We have, county commissioners and mayors that all over the state that I work with are not spreading and peddling misinformation and crazy ass theories. They're just trying to figure out how to make their communities better for the people who they're trying to serve. So in Washington State, I think we have a very different Republican Party, and one that is really focusing, I hope, on how do we improve the lives of the people that we're supposed to be serving. There's a lot of folks in this state who are getting fed up with a homelessness problem that is out of control. And if we start talking about the abysmal state of homelessness in Washington State, or how we need to repair a broken mental health system, or a drug addiction problem which is out of control, when we talk about those things, I think we're golden.
Bill, I think you're exactly right. I was speaking to a person considering a run in a small state the other day as a Republican, and he said, "What do I need to really run on?" He told me what he believed, and I said, "You believe in radical competence. You want to take care of business. You want to work on problems. You want to decontextualize all this stuff. You have a big overarching philosophy of individual responsibility and limited government and free markets, but you also want to fill in potholes and fix bridges and deal with problems, in your state." And I said, and that's where you go. And the difficulty for a lot of Republicans outside of Washington and maybe Vermont and one or two other states is that now it has become this litmus test of, do you love Donald Trump? Will you put Donald Trump above all others? And so you can't run in a Republican primary in Florida or North Carolina or Georgia or Texas or a number of large states without kissing the ring. And that becomes a political poison, as I'm sure you've seen out in the world, because you have to play defense on Trump all the time.
Rick, when I first heard of the Lincoln Project, and perhaps I'm wrong about this, but my first impression was that you were giving Republicans sort of permission to vote for Democrats. But looking ahead to 2022, the agenda is, well, it's bigger, it seems. It's, has more money. And it just seems like it's a different agenda. What's the 2022 plan here?
Well, look, we're a pro-democracy organization, first and foremost. And we believe that Donald Trump represented in 2020 an existential threat to the future of the republic, and that our small d democratic principles were on the chopping block, and that if they won that election, the abuse of power would be so rampant that the risk would be so great that we could lose this great country of ours. And we didn't want to we didn't want to like set our hair on fire. Not that I have any hair, but we didn't want to set our hair on fire about this. But it got more and more obvious that this was not a president who was equipped for the job. Now, in 2022, what we've seen is that this country now faces two fundamental crises. The first is still that ongoing crisis of democracy, that ongoing crisis of whether or not authoritarian nationalism will become a central tendency in American politics. We believe that authoritarian nationalism never turns out well, that it leads to almost inevitably to certain very bad outcomes wherever it's been iterated across the world. The second part of it is we face a challenge with COVID that has to be dealt with. And that's not a political challenge insofar as it has an ideological overhang. But for the purposes of their politics, Mitch McConnell would love to have Joe Biden not be able to roll out a great COVID plan. He would love to have the whole COVID problem go right off the rails. And that's for a political end to try to recapture the Senate in 2022. And so we believe you have to push back against both of those problems.
So you have all these companies that you've been talking to who are signing on not to support members of Congress who refuse to certify. That seems to be a big part of it.
We think that being part of a violent insurrection and funding the people that support a violent insurrection and funding, and this is something people haven't really thought through in a lot of the corporate spaces, and when we explain it to them, they really get it. The nut of most of the Trump lawsuits in key swing states like Georgia and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan. The nut of their lawsuits was to dismiss or disqualify African American voters in major metropolitan areas. And so when we tell corporate America, this is what you're paying for, this is what you're supporting, they have, in most of the cases we've encountered so far, said, not anymore. And look, corporations are their brand, and I hate the word brand. I hate it so much.
But
But
you
the
keep
brand
saying
of
it.
I know. We're stuck with it, I'm afraid. The idea that you are what you pay for, you are who you hire, you are who you support, is something that American voters have started to really look at. And so if you're Microsoft or Boeing, or if you're Geico, or if you're, Allstate Insurance, or if you're, Minute Maid orange juice, now you're thinking, do I want to be the guy who gives Rick Scott from the Senate committee $1 million or $2 million to go out and spend on a person like Ron Johnson or Ted Cruz or Josh Hawley? Because those people were all assertive members of the caucus that wanted to disqualify African American voters and overturn a free and fair election, and were just fine with giving the power fist to the rioters hours before this Capitol was stormed. So a lot of companies have been very clear about their discomfort with funding Rick Scott and Mitch McConnell's Senate committee. And a lot of them have been very direct about not supporting Steve Scalise and Kevin McCarthy's House fundraising efforts. So it makes it a little harder for these guys to engage in the politics they're in without any kind of accountability. And for a long time, Washington, they kept saying, we have to do something about money in politics. Well, nothing they ever did worked. But what we're doing, we think, can be effective because it's a direct link to a market force. And look, I'm a conservative still. I'm a market conservative. So I believe if you bring in market forces into this kind of equation, you end up downstream of those market forces. There's a political outcome.
So I have a question from Brett for both guests. We'll start with you, Bill. If we got rid of the Electoral College, could Republicans really win an election?
Well, I don't want to go off, although I would be happy to come back and go off on a whole segment on the Electoral College. But the one thing
maybe just answer his question briefly or quickly.
So what? Tell me out, Joni. What would we be able to win without it?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
If you have the right message, if you're talking to people about issues that are really going to affect their lives, if you have a messenger who they respond to, yes, we can win.
What's your take on that question about the Electoral College, Rick?
Well, I think Bill's point is correct. Look, the Electoral College in my lifetime, and I'm 57 years old, when I started in politics in 1988, California was a Republican state. Okay, and so the shift and the flow back and forth is very frequently about the messenger, the candidate. The policies are always secondary to the personality and to the candidate and their messaging, in the broadest sense. And so I think the Electoral College will become and look, I tell people this a lot. You can't hand wave the Electoral College away. It is going to require a meaningful constitutional amendment, which takes a generation. The pact of the states about the popular vote, it doesn't work. It's not constitutional. It will be dismissed. The court will take it, and even liberal justices on the court will go, no, this is an abrogation of constitutional strictures. So you can't hand wave it away. You can't pretend it doesn't exist and just say, oh, I don't like it anymore, it's gone. But Republicans can win it if they don't box themselves into a political dead end and end up saying that a Republican candidate nationally has to appeal to the hardest core MAGA conspiracy base in North Florida or South Alabama, and also try to go out and run and win in Washington State.
And you've got to have an agenda that resonates with people because it affects how they're going to live their lives. And if you continue to talk about crazy ass conspiracies or how elections were stolen, then you're not actually dealing with issues that
Bill, that's a good point, because maybe the main schism in this party right now is about the truth. So you have Marjorie Taylor Greene saying it's the party of Trump. You have Liz Cheney, the representative from Wyoming, right after winning her leadership challenge there, saying the only way the party can go forward is by getting to the truth.
There is
Right?
no justice without the truth.
So I have a question for you, Bill. How big is this? We're touting the Washington GOP. It is different, but how big? How much room is there in this party for people like Representatives Dan Newhouse and Jamie Herrera Butler, who both voted for impeachment, and they're both being told that they're in trouble for that.
I think that they are both in a very good position to maintain and hold their seats. In Washington state, we are not particularly ideological one way or the other as a whole, and we respect people who take votes of principle. And I think that you have two people there who took votes based on their own beliefs and their own principles, and I do not see them being punished for that, nor should they be.
Rick, I have a question for you about the language of politics. It says on your website that you do withering critiques of Donald Trump, and you do indeed. But you also sort of get into it with some spicy language sometimes with some of your critics. How does language, or how do all of we sort of heat things up by the way we speak?
Well, look, as I like to sometimes joke, I combine a classical education with being raised by wolves. And yes, I love the English language, and I love all of its variables and all of its variations. And I can curse like a sailor when the time comes, and I apply it strategically. Because look, I do not believe that the formalized sort of the honorable gentleman always counts. Sometimes you have to call somebody what they are. Sometimes you have to get in people's faces. Sometimes you have to strike with rhetorical skill that resets this idea, this formalized idea that both sides are doing the same exact thing. Because when somebody's saying Hillary Clinton eats babies in a pizza restaurant, the answer is not to try to talk them out of it. The answer is to say, you're out of your damn mind. Stop it, cut it out. And so I believe that language has enormous power. And I believe that the employment of it, and sometimes sometimes you want to use the right language to shake somebody. You want to use the right language to rattle somebody. You want to use the right language to reset the conversation. And sometimes that right language is a little salty. And I'm doing my very best. I know we don't have a beeper tonight, so I will not be as piratical as I normally might be.
Well, you were raised by the wolves. No issue there. I have a question for.
Can I jump in, Joni?
Yeah, go for it.
Rick, you're right that language can be the blunt instrument that sometimes is necessary to get people's attention, but it can also be an instrument that is used to engender even more or different fear and anger. Sure. And what we have not had is language that inspires us. And if this party is going to go forward, it can't be founded on fear and anger. It's got to inspire people that we can present a better program that is going to respond to their daily needs. And that inspiration in language has been totally absent in the last 8 years. It's time to start lifting people up and inspiring them and let them imagine what could be, as opposed to just dwelling on the angry scandal of the day.
I have a question from Liz for Rick Wilson. Will Republicans lose future elections because of the changing demographics of the U.S., or will they win because of gerrymandering and no Voting Rights Act?
Okay, let me break that down into three different parts, because it really is a tripartite question. The Voting Rights Act, and I do believe we need to restore a Voting Rights Act, but the Voting Rights Act that was dismantled over time had become very narrowly crafted. It was not a national Voting Rights Act anymore. It only applied to a few states and districts. It was not something that had the broad sweep that a legitimate Voting Rights Act of a modern Voting Rights Act would have. I think we need a modern Voting Rights Act. I truly do. Gerrymandering is one of those questions of good for the goose, good for the gander. Now, some states have adopted independent redistricting commissions, but a lot of them are still doing their redistricting based on political outcomes. It is a tougher question than a lot of people who go at this problem are willing to acknowledge. and I mean this as a cold political operator. You know, in a state like Florida, where the first people that would call the Republicans, who control the legislature for a generation now, during redistricting, were the Democratic African American members of the U.S. House. They wanted to protect their districts. Now, you could have had 5 or 6 more Democratic seats in the state, but you'd lose 2 of those African American seats. There's always a trade-off in redistricting on either side of the political equation. The Democrats use it with enormous efficiency in many states to take out Republicans. Republicans do the same thing. I'm in favor of nonpartisan redistricting. I'm in favor of shaking up these maps. And the difficulty you have in many states is you have a series of competing desires to have minority representation, to have progressive representation or conservative representation in various parts of the states. And those trade-offs are inherently political. I believe you reset the deck. What will that lead to? I think it's kind of what Bill and I would probably both like to see. More people who have practical, directed, policy-driven, people-centric things, and rather than people who are playing to the fringe on the left or the right,
And
in a stacked deck.
hold on, Johnny. I totally reject the presumption of that question. It presumes that, well, I guess the person who's asking the question, by changing demographics, they mean an increasing population of people of color. And the presumption is that Republicans can't get that vote. That's bullshit. If you go out,
See, I didn't get beeped.
if you go out with a program that responds to the dignity of families, and if we're going to be a party that really believes in the dignity of families, let's begin providing mental and dental and health care to kids. If we go out with a program that helps small businesses instead of dumping more taxes and regulations on them all the time, you're going to see a lot of people of color gravitating to the Republican Party.
Well, there's some sense that the Republican Party, depending on what happens, is maybe going to become 2 different parties. And I'm wondering if that happens, is it going to be like a temporary solution to sort of wait out the Trumpsters in some way? Or do you think it would be there for a long time, another new party?
I think that the party that is more likely to come apart at the seams is the Democratic Party. That for 8 years they have been held together by their hatred of President Trump. And now that he's gone, the left and the center of the Democratic Party are going to have to reconcile some differences that are just as great as perhaps the challenges confronting the Republican Party.
No doubt about it. I think Bill's exactly on target. There is a schism on the Bernie AOC wing of the party that is much more progressive, much more ambitious in terms of what they want to do politically. And there's a center Democratic Party that's the Obama, Biden, Clinton sort of zone that's much more effective electorally, but doesn't give everybody on the far progressive side what they want. There is a legitimate schism forming in that party. I will say this. There's a danger for the Republican Party if it doesn't start reforming itself in the post-Trump era. And in 1854, when the Whig Party supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which expanded slavery into the West, it was a poison pill. They needed it politically at that moment, but it killed the Whig Party. And they were gone by 1856 and replaced by the current Republican Party. So parties that make a fundamental mistake and don't correct it, they can lose out. They can disappear. They can fall from public, grace and consciousness. And I think that the number of people in the Republican Party who are pushing it towards that Whig outcome are the Matt Gaetzes, the Lauren Boeberts, the Marjorie Taylor Greenes, the Jim Jordans. Those people enjoy what they're doing right now, but it probably will have a devastating effect on the party in the long term. But those people more in the center right of the party, I think, offer a pathway out of the darkness. And it's ironic when people say, well, Liz Cheney's a liberal Republican now. I don't even know what that means. I worked for Dick Cheney. I know Liz Cheney. It's a very different definitional question,
Everything's upside down. I have a question from Linda for Bill Bryant, and I'm going to add to the question a little bit. But her question is, what does it say about Washington Republicans that Lauren Culp was the candidate? How moderate are Washington Republicans really? So maybe take that, and I'll come
Yeah, I mean,
back.
'cause, I do believe that we are different in Washington State, but then how do you reconcile that with the fact that you had a candidate like Mr. Culp? What you have is just electoral politics. You had a very, very crowded Republican primary with a lot of traditional conservatives and some mainstream Republicans, and they split the vote. And Lauren Culp managed to get through the primary with 17% of the vote. He went on to the general election and did worse than Rob McKenna, Dino Rossi, or I did. But that
But he
17% is a
hasn't
very
even
crowded
accepted
primary.
he hasn't even accepted the results of the election.
Whatever.
545,000 votes
You want to
separated
know how
him.
you reconcile that with the parties? You had a very crowded primary, and he got through with 17%.
So also,
Right.
Bill, King County Party Chairman Joshua Freed recently said that the mainstream Republicans in this state should take the Republican out of their name.
Yeah,
How does the GOP win in this state? I don't get how they're going to win in
I
this state
talked
if
to
they.
Joshua about that, and what he was really saying is that we needed to end the circle firing squad there. That mainstream Republicans need to quit treating the Trump supporters as some sort of fanatic fringe, and the Trump supporters need to quit calling every mainstream Republican a rhino. And that what we really need to start doing is focusing on the problems of King County, which is how do we come up with a program to really eliminate homelessness, not enable it, not become tolerant of it. What's our program for actually eliminating it? What are we going to do with the drug problem that we have in this county? If we talk about those issues, as opposed to having a circle shaped firing squad, we can move forward. But as long
Hmm.
as you've got mainstreamers thinking everybody else is a fanatic and the fanatics thinking everybody else is a rhino, this party is not going to move forward.
Rick, you were mentioning Liz Cheney. So what's going to happen to these Republicans who voted for impeachment? It's going to vary state by state, obviously,
Sure.
But here's Liz Cheney. We're talking about. She's probably in trouble in 2022. Plus
Well, she's been
43 Trump state, right?
there is a primary challenge already posted against her from a person who believes that QAnon is real, and that the Q conspiracy is a legitimate platform of governance. So we'll see where that leads. But a lot of them are going to get primaried by Trump folks. Now, a lot of those folks that are going to get primaried, who voted their conscience and voted to impeach Donald Trump, they're going to end up in a spot where those seats, the Trump candidates in some of those places, they'll win the primary. The MAGA candidate, the conspiracy candidate in some of those places will win the primary. And then they will lose the general. And there's nothing harder in Washington than being in the minority. And if you keep touching the hot stove of crazy, you're going to end up with a smaller minority than you had before. We learned in Georgia this year, one of the most devastating cuts against Kelly Loeffler was her association with Marjorie Taylor Greene, the QAnon folks. The QAnon stuff, particularly, and as Bill will probably tell you, is poison with voters who want people to get the job done and who aren't interested in lurid conspiracy theories or fantasies. They want a Republican who can come out and say, "Hey, I'm going to fix the potholes, work the homeless problem, get people vaccinated against COVID," not these esoteric conspiracy theories.
So I have a question for both of you. Republican Secretary of State Kim Wyman, as you probably know, is the only statewide elected official on the West Coast, lower 48. Pretty moderate person. She was at my class last week at the University of Washington, and she had been quoted. She gave an interview saying that she was wrestling with leaving the Republican Party, but she's been thinking about it, and she wants to work from within. Can you do that,
Yes,
Bill?
of course. I don't know why you couldn't, Joni. It's a function, as I said at the very beginning. It's the decisions we're going to make over the next 12 months. Are we going to decide to base and define this party on the identity of a former president, or are we going to go out and put together a program that responds to the needs of people in the 21st
Right.
century? And if we do that, and we present an alternative vision of the future, and we have pragmatic solutions for the problems that people are confronting every day, then yes, we can build a new party.
Well, Rick Wilson, you decided that you couldn't probably do it from within for yourself. You left the
Sure.
party in August. But
Well,
do you agree with Bill on that, or do you think, it's
look,
not going to work?
I believe, as I described a few minutes ago, the Republican Party is at a juncture. They're going to be the Whig Party and die, or they're going to take a very difficult step and say, we're not a party about the dear leader. We're not a party about one man. We're a party with principles and philosophies and policies, not just a party that wants to own the libs and hate the media. Because right now, a lot of the things Republicans once said they stood for, especially very Trump-centric Republicans, they have abandoned. It used to be about personal accountability and responsibility, not anymore. It used to be about fiscal probity, not anymore. It used to be about individual liberty, not so much. And so this sense with a lot of Republicans that Trumpism is the only future, I think is a very dangerous one. And again, look, there are things about a center-right message of the Republican Party that Bill's describing that many, many, many millions and millions of Americans find enormously appealing. But I think if you wrap it up in Trumpism and it sticks with that as the definitional nature of the party, because look, 2022, we're going to have more QAnon candidates, not fewer. We're going to have more people who say Trump won the election was a lie, not fewer. That to me is a very disturbing trend line. And I hope the GOP manages to break it. I hope they manage to get out of it. But it is still they're still in a box canyon politically right now, and it's real hard to turn the wagon train around.
So I have an audience question from Jiao for Rick Wilson. How does the GOP overcome the legacy of dog whistle racist messaging that's been deployed consistently since Barry Goldwater's campaign? Isn't Trump just the legacy of that tactic?
I don't want to let that go as sort of flippantly as a lot of people do, because I'm going to give you a couple of examples from my political life. I was a young guy in college when I saw Ronald Reagan at CPAC go and tear the hide off of David Duke and the Klan. Absolutely said unequivocally, get the hell out of here. We don't want you in our party. We don't welcome you in our party. GTFO. And when I worked for George Herbert Walker Bush, I was an appointee in the government. I worked for the Secretary of Defense at the time, Dick Cheney. And when David Duke ran for governor of Louisiana, they deployed a bunch of young guys like me. We all went down to Louisiana to beat David Duke on the president's orders because he wasn't going to tolerate it. Okay. He wasn't going to have a Klansman as an elected Republican official. Well, now, in the Charlottesville environment and beyond, where the president, the prior president, was profoundly influenced by the Steve Bannon white nationalism, by nationalist populism, which they believe that immigrants are dirty and they pollute our gene pool, and they abandoned the idea that America's a propositional nation. That is a party that has aggressively embraced a racial set of tropes under Trump that I think were very damaging to the GOP. Now, one thing we did learn this year is that working class voters, regardless of race, find a message of populism somewhat appealing. That's a cautionary note because, as my friend Reed Galen says, a 30-year-old Cuban guy working on a road crew in Orlando, Florida, and a 30-year-old Anglo guy working on the road crew, they're the same person. They may have different ethnicities, but their economic drivers are similar. So the idea that the Republican Party has, since Trump and Charlottesville particularly, been okay with the overt racism, it makes everything from Barry Goldwater look like an amateur. At no point, would you see a Ronald Reagan or a George Bush or George W. Bush go out and nod and wink and say they're good people on both sides to a rally of neo-Nazis and Klansmen.
So, Bill, I have a question for you, and that has to do with, we were talking about this before the show, how do you get the word out? There's a lot of new people in Washington State, so many newcomers. And, maybe they do or don't know much about the GOP, but you said that you found it sort of frustrating to convey that this is, a little bit of a different party, and that it's, it has environmentalists like yourself who believe in climate change and combating climate change. How do you get that message out?
It's really difficult. I mean, Dan Evans, former governor, and Senator Dan Evans chaired all three of my campaigns, the two in King County and then my unsuccessful gubernatorial campaign. And when I was running for governor, some people, usually people over 70, would say, "Oh, Bill, you've got to let people know that Dan Evans is chairing your campaign." And I'd say, most people don't know who Dan Evans is. 1 million people have moved into King County since Dan Evans was elected governor, or since he left the governor's mansion. 1 million people. They have no understanding that the Republicans in Washington state are very different than the Republicans nationally. They don't know, for example, that it was Republicans who put in the Constitution that it will be the paramount responsibility of the state to ensure every child gets an equal education, or that they bolstered education funding, or that Dan Evans created the community college system before there were community colleges all around the country, or that it was Republicans, Bruce Chapman, Ralph Monroe, Dan Evans, who made sure that every child, even if they have physical or mental disabilities, has equal access to the classroom. That was Republicans. Hold on, Joni. It was Republicans who ensured that women would get equal pay, that it was a community property state, and that they could have their own, get this, their own checking account without their husband's signature on it. That equality was driven by the Republican Party in Washington state.
Well, Jane wants to ask you.
The environmental legacy is long and huge. So we need to figure out how we can let people know that the Republicans here are a bit different. Now, people will say, do we want to resurrect the party of Dan Evans? I'm saying, hell no. I don't want to recreate the party of the 1970s. I want to create a party of Bill Bryant that's relevant to the 21st century.
Well, but Jane has a question from you, from our audience. She says, all that's well and good, but why do Republicans keep losing in Washington state for statewide positions, I presume?
When Rob McKenna ran for governor in 2012, there has since been, who is a very moderate, thoughtful, conservative, fiscal conservative guy, there have been 300,000 people move into the state, into the county since then. 300 people moving in from out of state into King County. They just see the R and the D. They're totally unaware of the tradition of Republican elected officials in Washington state. And we have got to let them know that we have a great deal to offer. And we have got to listen to some of those people who really feel they have been left behind.
Okay. Well, I'd like to read a letter. This is for you, Rick. I'm going to read from a letter of somebody who wrote into the Maine newspaper of all things. I leave the Republican Party because it has become a sycophant to former President Donald Trump. By continuing to support him, the party, with the exception of a few courageous members, has betrayed every principle of truth, honor, decency, and morality that I believe in, and I can no longer be a part of it. So, to you, Rick, what about that person? Where's the landing space for that person, the home for that person?
That person's going to have a narrowing range of options in most places. Now, in Washington, Bill and other folks may be able to find them a landing spot. But in most states, that person is politically homeless. And in states that are performing Republican states, that person is definitely politically homeless. They don't have a place to go right now. They don't have a landing space right now. Because if you want to run for office in North Carolina or Missouri or Michigan or Wisconsin as a Republican, you have to be the most Trumpy Trumper in the Trump primary, because that's all the primary is about now. Is about, are you the most Trump-oriented candidate? You will not see a lot of moderate Republicans sneaking through, except in a few places like Washington, Vermont, Massachusetts, Maryland, maybe Virginia. But for the most part, at this moment, the fever of Trumpism has not broken inside the GOP. And so you're going to continue to see that as the number one litmus test for candidates in the primaries going forward.
So I'm running out of time here, but I wonder from both of you, this is admittedly a very low moment for the GOP, but what positive thing can happen from this? I'll start with you, Bill. 20 seconds each, my producer.